Given the impact Ali Shariati had on the Iranian youth during his lifetime, it is no surprise that his sudden and mysterious death in June 1977 was immediately felt across Iran. Upon hearing the news, the already established student movement were mobilized, partly due to the suspicions of the nature of Shariati's death. In order to understand the controversy surrounding his death, we have to go back 4 years to September 28, 1973, when Shariati was arrested by the Shah's Iranian secret police known as Savak for subversive activities and plotting against state security. This was largely due to the lectures he gave at Urshad, which was closed a year earlier for its anti-Shah political activity. He was imprisoned for 18 months at Comitet, which was known for its harsh measures of torture against political opponents. However, given Shariati's importance to the Iranian youth, his life in prison was relatively privileged to avoid provocation. He was not physically tortured, he was allowed books and given food from outside the prison. On the 21st of March 1975, Shariati was unexpectedly released from prison, which caused some speculation on the regime's motives. The Savak's explanation was that during his time in prison, Shariati had realised the faults in his previous writings and should be allowed to correct these by writing 2 new books named Mankind, Islam and Western Philosophy, and Return to Oneself at Home. These books were published in a daily serial in the national youth newspaper, Kayan, and clearly departed from his previous views on social change, instead supporting the Shah's position of national solidarity and a rejection of Marxism. It was therefore clear that Shariati was either collaborating with the regime or coerced into writing for them. He was unable to explain himself or connect with his supporters. What we do know is that he was under constant surveillance by the Savak, who monitored his whereabouts, tapped his phones and threatened him and his family, constantly thus making his life unbearable. Not having such a high profile, Shariati knew his family would not be treated as well as he was in Comitet. Shariati became depressed and by February 1977 decided the only solution was to flee the country and create a new Urshad in England. Eventually, Shariati arrived in Southampton, but within 3 weeks he died of what the coroner's report identified as a heart attack. Given the invasive network of the Savak and the context of their surveillance, many of Shariati's followers suspected they had assassinated him fearing his revolutionary activities abroad. However, given the immense stresses in his life and the fear that his wife, who remained in Iran, would be arrested, Ali Ranima suggests that a heart attack doesn't seem that unlikely, even at the young age of 43. When news of his death reached Tehran, preparations were made to retrieve his remains, and many of his supporters wanted to turn his arrival into an anti-regime demonstration, which was possible as the effects of the Shah's new liberalisation programme were making themselves felt. However, several of his followers were in England at the time and thought that the government would give him full honours to discredit his anti-regime ideology. Therefore, they planned to have his body flown to Damascus instead. Before 1977, student protests against the Shah were limited to campus areas, but following Shariati's death, these became national movements of Marxist and religious leftist groups. Once these movements began, they only intensified throughout 1978, with portraits of Shariati being carried through the major cities of Iran. This is not to say that Shariati's death was the only factor in sparking mass movement, as the death of Khomeini's son in October 1977, also thought to be the work of the Savak, was similarly incendiary, as was the gradual increase of repression and economic pressures on the Iranian public. However, Shariati's importance to the students who led the movement and the suspected involvement of the Savak in his death was undoubtedly central for the growth of the protests. Khomeini is seen as a central ideologue who had been preaching for 10 years prior to 1977. However, to attest for the importance of Shariati, it was only upon his death that the student movement became nationwide, highlighting both the importance of his ideas and the impact of his death. Shariati's death, however, meant that the popular movement he had created fell into the hands of Khomeini, who had also grown in popularity, and at first seemed to represent a similar position to Shariati, advocating for democratic rule, appointing liberals such as Mehdi Bazargan as Prime Minister and Bani Sadr as President. However, the widespread desire for greater freedom and social equity were left without a leader, as Khomeini worked towards his true goal of creating a government led by the clerics. His ideology for his government was called Velayat Faqih, where the most learned cleric, Khomeini himself, represented the hidden 12th Imam, guiding the population towards a true Islamic society. For the full explanation of this concept, see our video on Imamat and Velayat Faqih. He thus systematically purged Iran's universities and left-wing organisations and hijacked the revolutionary ideal away from Shariati's vision. Shariati's death remains a mystery until today and is essential to understanding the sudden growth of the revolutionary movement in 1977 and the change in direction of the subsequent clerical regime under Khomeini. To see the work we have done towards uncovering these mysteries, watch this video where you can see the works we've undertaken and what we have found out.